Everybody, I am Charlie Thomas. I'm Executive Director of ACTC, and welcome to our second Spring 2021 Core Conversation live Q&A. I'm going to hand it over to Dan Cullen in just a second, who will make a few brief remarks, and then the rest of this session will be up to you. Will be a conversation about Rousseau and Dan's presentation, or whatever we want to talk about. One quick note about how this works is it's helpful. This is a small enough group. I think you can just wave and I'll find you and keep a normal queue. But if you'd like to use the technology, Zoom has moved this, so I learned that now you have to click on reactions. It used to be you clicked on participants, but now you click on reactions, and raise hand is an option there. So if you'd like to do that, that'll show up and I'll obviously see you, but if you prefer just to wave your hand, that's fine. It is helpful, and it looks like everybody's there already. It is helpful to mute yourselves unless you're actually speaking, so that we don't face feedback and talking over each other and delays and things like that. But okay, with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Cullen to you. He's a professor of political science and humanities at Rhodes College and a member of the board of directors of ACTC. Dan, it's all yours.
Thanks, Charlie. I was just wondering if there's an emoji for volcanic reaction on my Zoom screen. So I have forgotten most of what I said in the interview a couple of weeks ago, and it occurred to me last night I could go back and look at the video, but that would trigger a painful experience of amour propre, because I'd be comparing myself to Joe, and I just didn't want to do that. So I'll try to reset what I think I was getting at back then. A lot has intervened. I was just saying I've been plunged back with all of Memphis into the state of nature over the last week. Without electricity, freezing cold. I went out for a walk yesterday after plowing my driveway, with a shovel, a broken 2-foot plastic shovel. I'm feeling the pain from that today. And I walked around my neighborhood, and I saw this couple fumbling with an electrical cord, trying to get an electric snow shovel to work to clear off their driveway, and they couldn't do it, and they were completely lost. And it just made me think of the relative advantages of natural man over civilized man when we find ourselves closer to our original condition. So I think what I hope we'll get to in the conversation in a moment is how some of you approach Rousseau, or how you might want to. I'm really interested in how those of you who teach Rousseau use Rousseau, so to speak, along with other core texts in your own courses. I'll say a little bit perhaps about what I've done in that regard, but that's of real interest to me. So my concern is not so much Rousseau per se, but Rousseau in the kind of courses that we typically offer, we ACTC people. So what's the big issue that Rousseau deals with in the discourse? And even though he only uses this term once there, and in passing, I'd offer that it's the natural goodness of man. Rousseau famously said that the fundamental principle of all morality is that man is naturally good, loving justice, loving order. There's no original perversity in the human heart, he says, and he this is from a letter to Archbishop Beaumont, who canceled Rousseau and censored Émile, and this was part of Rousseau's defense. And he added to this explanation of his intention that the first movements of nature are always right, toujours droit. And it's very interesting. Those of you who know the social contract will remember this important statement where Rousseau says, "The volonté générale est toujours droit." It's the same phrase, and so there's an interesting parallelism there that I've tried to think about over the years. Another big point connected to this: the single passion with which we are born, Rousseau says, is amour de soi-même, love of self. And he says, and this is in the same letter to Beaumont, that passion is indifferent in itself to good and evil. So it can develop either way. It becomes good or evil only by accident. It's a very important claim. Only by accident in the circumstances in which it develops. And I'm quoting Rousseau verbatim on this. And it's that complex of ideas or propositions that the discourse develops. Natural goodness, an original experience of love of self, so a kind of selfishness, right? But one that doesn't have the bad consequences that we associate with human self-centeredness in the society in which we know. And Rousseau's great claim is, looking at the society we know, we must not conclude from what we see that we're looking at human nature per se. We're looking at a corruption of it. And he accuses Hobbes of making this error, that Hobbes purported to be describing natural man, and instead he was giving us a portrait of social man, which indeed is true. But one shouldn't confuse the two. And so the discourse starts off with this interesting methodological problem, right? First of all, how do we know what that original uncorrupted human being is or look like, since we can't see it anymore? And in this context, Rousseau refers to the Platonic discussion at the end of the Republic of the statue of Glaucus, where Plato said, Rousseau doesn't mention Plato, but this is where he gets it. The human soul has become disfigured, and we need to think about what the soul would be like if it wasn't corrupted, wasn't contaminated. And whereas Plato is concerned about the contamination of the soul by the body, Rousseau talks about the changes that have occurred to the human soul in the circumstances of its historical development. And so he has to offer a conjectural history of that development, and that's what the discourse does. And here's what he says about it. This is, I'm quoting a passage from the preface. He says, "It's no small undertaking to separate what is original from what is artificial in the present nature of man, and to know correctly a state which no longer exists, which perhaps never existed, which probably never will exist, and about which it is nevertheless necessary to have the most precise notions in order to judge our present state correctly." So that's an interesting problem that has to be unwound. But I'd emphasize that last part, that it's about judging our present state correctly. Because we might think, looking at our present state, that, well, human nature is what it is, and we're victims of original sin, etc. And that's what Rousseau is challenging. So how to do it? Famously, he says we need to sort of strip away all of these accretions to our original nature that have grown up in the course of historical development. And the image of the sea god Glaucus, Rousseau adds the statue of the sea god Glaucus, is a very interesting way to think about that. So what does it all amount to? That he's offering what you could call a non-teleological account of the development of the human, the development of the human being we see now, away from what he refers to as man as nature formed him. And when Rousseau gets back to that layer, or to that bottom level, what we're presented with is a being who is indistinguishable from an animal. And Rousseau struggles to try and indicate what is the distinctive human thing that makes us different from an animal, because and one has to see he must do that, because otherwise what relevance is this portrait of original man going to have for our judgment of l'homme present man, if they're simply dichotomous beings? There has to be a link. And so he tries to account for that link, which he ultimately does in terms of perfectibility. But the whole tenor of the argument is to show that although there is, so to speak, a capacity to become a being like the one we see before us now, that capacity need not have been developed. It's really important for Rousseau to insist that it was an accidental trigger that, so to speak, propelled human beings out of the natural condition into the social condition, and then with all of the attendant corruptions of social life. And for him, that is enough, right? He says, I think I mentioned this in my remarks last time, that at the very end of the discourse, he says, it's sufficient for me to have shown that this was not the original condition of man. And so it could have been the case that we might have remained in a non-social, non-developed condition. Now, does Rousseau seriously mean to maintain that that would have been the best human condition? I think the answer to that is no, but it's complicated. And the question certainly comes up: is Rousseau suggesting that we just want to, or we should try to somehow go back to that? And he says there's no going back. So an interesting question arises about how one might recover something like the natural condition in social circumstances or on the human plane. And I think that's where one, in my experience anyway, this has been the case, that's where we have the really interesting discussions about, so is he correct that we have lost something important about ourselves, that we live unnaturally? What would it mean to live more naturally? And above all, what does it mean? What does it mean to be condemned to live with the passion of a new kind of self-love, amour propre, what usually translated as vanity, but living, as Rousseau famously put it, only in the eyes of others and losing the sentiment of our own existence. What can we do about that? Once we become aware that that might be a problem for us and could be the source of all of our troubles, as Rousseau says with characteristic exaggeration, amour propre is the source of all the vices, and it can be turned to a better purpose, although he doesn't develop that in the discourse itself. But I think that's where one can have really interesting conversations. And I'll stop with this. This is also, I think, where at least I begin to think of turning to literature later on in a course to show what I would describe as an essentially Rousseauian problem appearing in works of literature that many of us probably teach. I used to teach assign Melville's Billy Budd in close proximity to Rousseau. I used to end the course that was a 4-semester course some years ago with Camus' The Stranger, because it seemed to me, and this isn't an original insight of mine, that Meursault is really like what Rousseau refers to as l'homme physique. His reactions to people are always just physical reactions, and when he's forced to explain why he pulled the trigger, he says, "C'est la chaleur," was the heat, and he doesn't have moral relations with the people in his life, with his friend and with the woman who loves him. She wants to know about love. He just shrugs. Okay, if you want me to. It's really quite interesting. He seems to be a pre-socialized, pre-moralized human being who's nevertheless living in the midst of society. So I love talking about the subject of possible Rousseauian novels or plays. Molière's The Misanthrope is another one that I think I see Rousseauian echoes in, or pre-echoes in. So I'll stop. This is getting too much about me.
Okay, the queue's open. Joe.
I'm going to press Dan to think about something that I'm thinking about now and that he and I will be thinking about together in a few weeks. And that is the Rousseau-Smith connection. And in particular, I had one of my better students this past week, and I was teaching the second discourse, asked me what the practical consequences of the second discourse were. I mean, what lessons should we draw from it? What political consequences are there? And I trotted out my stock answer, which is, well, there's the social contract, Sparta, which is one, and then there's Emile, and then there's a solitary walker, all of which are possible consequences, none of which are particularly practical for most of us. It seems to me, however, that in some ways, and I'd like you to comment on this and correct me if I'm wrong, that Smith takes Rousseau's line of argument and runs with it in a kind of practical way, or a semi-practical way, in the theory of moral sentiments. And I wonder if what you think of that line of argument / inquiry.
Yeah, I guess I want to hear a little more about exactly what you mean by a practical way, because Smith certainly has Rousseau open in front of him as he's writing the theory of moral sentiments. And as you know, he did a book review of the second discourse. It's always seemed to me that Smith accepted Rousseau's diagnosis of call it the problem of social man, but thinks that indeed there's a better solution to it, or better response to it, from the perspective of society as a whole. But he doesn't deny what Rousseau would focus on, the calamitous effects on the individual. And I'm thinking of the poor man's son passage in particular. So, but I'm still not grasping what you have in mind when you refer to Smith's more practical take on it.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about the impartial spectator and the way in which that seems like a more plausible reorientation of amour propre than Spartan citizenship, for example. And it doesn't require the kind of elaborate, almost mythical pedagogical apparatus that Rousseau constructs in Emile.
Yeah. So I'll be contentious for the sake of fun. That there, I would say Smith is really challenging Rousseau on a matter of absolutely decisive importance for Rousseau, and that is what I refer to as the calamitous consequences of amour propre. Right? Smith's whole moral theory, I would say, is predicated on the notion that no, the experience of amour propre is a good thing, because it is spectatorship, and it's that capacity for spectatorship in Smith's mind that allows precisely for us to be moral, and be moral in a way that is spontaneous and free, and perhaps ultimately compatible with a kind of independence. But whereas Rousseau says, right, referring to what we imagine others are thinking about us, or imagining the judgment that others are imposing on us, which in fact they are always doing, right, has these destructive effects for human psychological well-being and unity and ultimately independence. And Smith, as I understand him, just disagrees with that. So it's really interesting that I think they agree on the facts of how human psychology works in social relations. Rousseau thinks the effects are a disaster, and Smith sees it as the source of human promise and putting social life on a good foundation. So I guess I just see that as an interesting philosophical quarrel, and I go back and forth as to whose side I tend to be on. I think Smith is much more hopeful, and there's and Smith is very impressive. I've never quite been able to shake my Rousseauian skepticism about Smith's view, though, and get into quarrels occasionally with my numerous Adam Smith scholar friends.
I guess I'm inclined to agree with you that it is a quarrel, and I also vacillate in much the same way. I think Smith tries to build something positive out of it, and we can question to the degree to which he's successful. And drives us in the direction which I regard as in some ways an unfortunate direction of Kant. And Kantian rational religion, which amounts to systemization in some ways of the impartial spectator. But I'll let other people jump in now.
Yeah, let me just say that I'm afraid that maybe we lapsed into some inside baseball inside baseball there. So what we're adverting to in Smith is this interesting discussion where Smith essentially describes a human being who lives his life trying to get ahead, who's immersed in the rat race, and then on his deathbed realizes that indeed he spent too many hours at the office, right? And it's a horrible recognition, and it's clear that Smith is alluding to Rousseau in this passage. And then there's this other shoe that drops after Smith paints this really sad outcome. He says, and it is good that nature imposes on us in this way. It's good that this illusion, he admits the person who has lived this way, chasing prosperity and riches and reputation and so on, suffers from it and is rendered miserable in the end and has wasted his life. And yet it's a good thing, not a bad thing, right? Because we get all of these beneficial consequences for society as a whole, but you're left thinking that still the poor man's son has paid this price. I've always thought it was really a poignant admission on the part of Smith. Anyway, that's the context.
Yeah. And I'm going to pitch it over to Paige, but also remember the way that the poor man's son is introduced. It's the poor man's son whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition.
Yeah.
All right, Paige, it's you.
Oops,
Paige, you're muted. You're still muted, Paige.
There. I was saying, until I so rudely muted myself, that Dan got me all worked up talking about the literature that you use in your course. And I was hoping to get you to talk about Rousseau's own literature, Rousseau as novelist, a little bit. And to do that, we have to get you to bring up the subject of women and Rousseau. My introduction to Rousseau, and I've only been introduced to him. We never got to know each other, but it was Julie or the La Nouvelle Héloïse. Yep. And so I read that 50 years ago, and I know there's been a lot of discussion of Rousseau and women, but also I'm interested in why he made that turn to fiction in his own work, what he thought could be done. And I also wanted to notice that you had avoided the cheapening of Rousseau that we usually get with the noble savage terminology. And so I was going to throw that in as a only halfway related question.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, I wish you had stayed muted, Paige, because I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not going to be able to give you not only not a good answer about the Nouvelle Héloïse, but any answer, because I just don't have a confident sense about it. And it's a book. It's a novel I read the first time almost 50 years ago myself, and it's one that I haven't studied. So I'd just be spouting sort of useless, superficial impressions. But I'll say this, that I think that why did Rousseau turn to literature? To me, the answer is just his prodigious imagination and energy. I think I mentioned last time, a couple of weeks ago, that Rousseau keeps coming back to the question of what might be done to perhaps at least ameliorate the human predicament. And that causes him to explore that in all sorts of different genres. And Emile being the most significant of them all. It's true that Julie was his greatest hit, and the novel has just been forgotten, which is one reason why I've paid so little attention to it. Not much payoff there because nobody knows it. Nobody knows it anyway. But is it? I guess I'm. This is the thing I'm most unsure about. Should one say it's really a didactic novel where Rousseau is just using it as a vehicle to paint his doctrine in a new way, or does it break new ground? And that's the thing that I'm really unsure of, and I don't even want to speculate about, so forgive me for that. As for the noble savage term, yeah, Rousseau never used it. And I think it's important to make that point, because Rousseau did say later, when he was commenting on his thought in the second discourse, that look, natural man, this is the way he puts it, il est nul, il est bête, he's nothing, he's a beast, right? So can't be a model really for human flourishing. And yet it's nevertheless important to make the argument of the discourse about origins and the development. But Rousseau is not, he's not guilty of Voltaire's famous brush off, right? When Rousseau, he opened the book and wrote to Rousseau and said, "Thank you for your new book against the human race. Reading it made me want to get down on all fours and crawl around." It's a great zinger, but unfair. And yet Rousseau has to be held responsible for his rhetoric. That's true. And the image of natural man is powerful.
I'm going to indulge myself and jump in here. At the end of the recording, the conversation we had a couple weeks ago, Dan, I prompted it because I asked something about Montaigne, but you brought up of cannibals, and then literally at the last 5 seconds, and we had to end it there. So for the sake of time, I won't fill in all the blanks, and maybe I'm skipping some important things, and you can tell me, but. I always kind of worry that there's something a little bit circular about this claim that in the state of nature men are naturally good, and just using of cannibals and maybe Rousseau's use of cannibals to sort of point to what always kind of looks like a circle to me. Is this idea, okay, in the state of nature, men are naturally good, not that we can return to that, not that this is a model for us, they're beasts. But on the other hand, you look at something like cannibalism, Montaigne does it brilliantly, and argues that, if we kind of get past the surface of things, we can identify with the impulses that drive cannibals to cannibalism, filial piety to your parents and ancestors, that sort of thing. They're playing it out in a way that we can't accept, but really we have more in common with them on some sort of fundamental moral level than one would think if you just look at the way that cannibalism appears to us to be taboo and the way it appears to them to be pious. But it seems like that argument is cannibalism is okay because it's natural. But in the state of nature, men are naturally good. Doesn't that feel a little circular? I mean, aren't we It is, and maybe this is an impossible thing, but could Rousseau ever present any kind of evidence of natural goodness? Is that a falsifiable claim? Either you know, in any sense. Maybe I'll just leave it there. So, in the state of nature, every internaturally good, and really don't worry so much about cannibalism, because it's just something they do naturally, and it's fundamentally derived from a moral instinct that we can appreciate. It just seems to go round and round to me.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and so I put it this way. Rousseau mentions in one of the notes we're not supposed to read, and it's nothing to see there. That's where he mentions natural goodness in the discourse, and says that he's demonstrated it, and he really hasn't demonstrated any such thing, at least by that point in the discourse. So what does he mean? And I think he means this, that man is naturally good, again, not in a moral sense, because he's pre-moral, but the natural condition is such that we're not in a zero-sum game in the way that we are in the social condition, right? And Rousseau makes this exaggerated claim, and here's another reason why one should compare him with Adam Smith. He says, in social life, one person can't get ahead but at the expense of someone else. Right? Whereas in the natural condition, it's possible that human beings will harm one another. Right? But there's no, or maybe this is the way to put it, they might injure one another, but there's no real harm in a moral sense, because there isn't the special kind of will or ill will that develops in society. And so I think what Rousseau is hovering around all the time is this notion that in the natural condition, where we're motivated by self-love, and we are concerned for our own preservation, we'll act in a certain way that could indeed have negative effects for other people. But the crucial thing is, we are not in a social relation. And that makes all the difference, that we are not conscious of others. We're not conscious of harming others. It's not our intention to harm others. We're following our own natural inclination, but it's as though we're in this enclosure. And it's that thing that allows for Rousseau to say we are naturally good, or another way to put it might be we are naturally innocent. In other words, the emphasis always seems to be on the contrast with social life. And it's not so much that there's any, and in fact not at all, that there's some positive goodness about natural man. It's more that he is not bad in the human sense. There's no such motivation. And by the way, natural man can't be congratulated for this. It's not some kind of moral achievement, because again, this is all pre-moral. It's simply that nature has left human beings originally in a kind of equilibrium, in a fortunate condition where we can satisfy our needs without this deadly social rivalry and all its consequences. However, all that said, right, Rousseau shows that this condition can be upset like that. It takes, he says at one point, the least change in circumstances. And so it appears as though it's inevitable that we will be propelled out of this condition. And at the same time, he insists that, strictly speaking, it didn't have to happen. Right? And I think he has to say that. He has to say that in order to preserve the critical leverage that the notion of natural man has for the judgment of social man. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It feels
sure.
like, though, in that description, everything you said could have been attributed to the account of Eden in Genesis, or the account of the healthy city in Book 2 of the Republic. That it sounded to me like there was nothing in what you said that couldn't easily go to one of those two cases. Am I missing something, or does that seem right to you?
I'd need to think more about it, but I see your point. And another work of literature that reminds me of Rousseau, and I've made this connection, is Paradise Lost, and Eve's claim that, if she wants to go out, and Adam says, be careful, there's threats and snares out there, and she refers to the insufficiency of a merely cloistered virtue. Right? And I think that's an apt parallel to the kind of cloistered goodness that natural man, you can't call it virtue in the condition of natural man, but I'd suggest the cloistered goodness of natural man while he remains in this fortunate condition, which he is not responsible for, right? It's only the beneficiary of it. And I think Rousseau himself is aware of that. I think he even emphasizes it. But I'm still not sure that I'd agree the concept of natural goodness is circular. It's not simply that things are good because they are natural, or natural because they are good. There's more in there that has to do with the conditionality of the state of nature. It sounds like
that's
a
very
French term, doesn't it? Conditionality.
That was very that was very, very helpful, Dan. I see what it doesn't feel circular to me in the same way. Appreciate that. Josh, you're next.
Yeah, this may actually just be a way of extending Charlie's question, but I teach Rousseau at a university where people, students that is, take original sin very seriously. Now, it's hard for me to have a really good sense of exactly the historical situation in Rousseau's case, whether people were still taking original sin terribly seriously in France at his time, at least in the circle of those he was interested in influencing. But how do you get a student who takes original sin seriously to take Rousseau's argument seriously? It seems to me actually very, very, very difficult to get them to take it seriously.
I haven't had that experience, strangely enough, even though I teach in Memphis, right? I find students are powerfully persuaded by Rousseau's account of the psychology of amour-propre. And even though it is so, it's so comprehensive and therefore extreme, I think it makes a lot of sense to them. And the idea that what we might call sinfulness, all the bad things that we do in our daily lives, can be explained by Rousseau's thesis that we're entrammeled in this horrible dynamic where we're driven to both dominate people because of our desire for recognition or just our insecurity about our status in the eyes of others, that we find ourselves both becoming servile and domineering at the same time. And that accounts for a lot of maybe all of the bad stuff that we do to one another. I've found that students take that quite seriously. And I haven't, surely I've heard this objection, but I don't recall it being routine and frequent. The objection that, wait a minute, Rousseau's avoiding the point that human beings just suffer from sinfulness by definition. They've already had elaborations of that from Calvin before they read Rousseau. And what I find is that nobody brings back Calvin against Rousseau or Hobbes against Rousseau, that Rousseau gets some purchase on them in that regard. Now, that doesn't mean that they become Rousseauians. It just means that they're surely unsettled by reading Rousseau, but they really think there's something insightful about this. And I connect it with this too, Josh, or at least I've seen this, that they're very impressed with the idea that the thing that social beings have lost is sincerity. They're persuaded that Rousseau is onto something when he emphasizes that we just, we routinely dissemble, lie to one another in order to, tell white lies, right, social lies, just to make life bearable. And we all know that we're not being sincere, and yet there comes a point where perhaps the cost of keeping this double ledger with our relations with people, even with our intimate relations, becomes or can become unbearable. That's the great point about Moliere's play, the Misanthrope. Right, the character Alceste is the one that Moliere is criticizing, and Rousseau famously identifies with him. He mentions this in the letter to d'Alembert, and in the play, Alceste cries out in pain when his friend Philinte, I think his name is, asks him, what do you want from us? You're such a pain in the ass, and he says, "Soyez sincère." Just be sincere, be truthful. I want honesty. I want sincerity. And I can't go to a party and put on this mask and do all the things that we need to do to get along. I've always found that Rousseau's portrayal of that, which students are, of course, thoroughly familiar with, makes an impression on them. So, yeah, I just haven't had that particular response, or at least I don't recall it being a dominant one. How do you manage it? What kind of discussion?
I don't know that I've come up with a really good way of managing it. I suppose one could come up with some kind of a historical argument that one wouldn't have ended up with the vision of society that could be characterized as Hobbesian if not for that original approach to man. That is to say, perhaps original sin somehow got us to the point such that society could be described in the way that Hobbes portrayed it. It may well be this is the only kind of response one can have to that late historical development. But of course, they think Hobbes is completely wrong as well. So they would blame that on Hobbes. So it's not much of an answer. So I don't really have a good answer for serious Catholics as opposed to, say, Calvinists.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's an easy, convincing argument to take Rousseau very seriously.
There's definitely not an easy argument. Yeah.
Tim, did you have your hand up? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I did. I'm not sure if there's time, but I love that Charlotte and Joshua, I was thinking the same, probably the same thing you were. And I'm one of those students you were describing. I'm one of those like ultra Orthodox Catholics. And so, but I was fascinated. I learned so much from your talk because when you were running through this idea that like we have no access to like how, where, and when it all went wrong, but it did all go wrong in a corporate sense for humanity. But then learning about sort of what we would call prelapsarian man is very fruitful, will help us understand our current condition. That's sort of the whole foundation of John Paul II's philosophy and theology. I was like, he agrees with you. But then my question kind of became, after hearing the other questions, was, well, how does culpability work for Rousseau? Is there corporate culpability? Is there individual culpability for anyone? Or is it just sort of be sincere, sorry, that this happened somewhere back then? We do end up asking similar questions. So anyway, I was just interested in that. With the very little time you have left, if you have any idea about how culpability functions for Rousseau.
Yeah, there's definitely culpability. Although, bottom line, it remains crucial to Rousseau to insist that it's not, well, as I quoted him, no original perversity in the human heart. That corruption is attributable to sociality. So this is the most radical thing about Rousseau, right? And now one has to bring in Aristotle and to say, look, why is it more plausible to define human beings by their origin as opposed to their completion? Right? It's a very, very important point. It's as though here's one way I've put it, and I think I may believe this. I hedge because I just go back and forth on what I really think, understand, believe about Rousseau. But it seems to me he's making a claim such as this. Could it be the case that human beings are really meant for social life when it is so fraught with pain, misfortune, evil, sin, if you like? Isn't it odd that this is the fulfillment of our nature, that this is our destiny? I think Rousseau almost starts from just the observation that if human beings are so miserable in the social world, it would be extraordinary to think that that's consistent with our nature. So our unhappiness, which Rousseau takes very seriously, and it's not hard to disagree with that premise, I think, that our unhappiness, even now in social life, in social relations, is an important piece of evidence about what our nature is really for, what our nature is or meant to be. And I think from that awareness, Rousseau then considers, look, maybe it is the case that it's sociality that is the cause of our suffering. And it's not implausible that there has been a development. Rousseau says, look, just look at the world we live in now and see the variety of ways of being human, right? It's not a stretch to think that human beings are malleable. And therefore it's not a stretch to think that something has developed over time, layer upon layer. And don't we have an intuitive sense of the inflation of our needs? You know, he makes an important point in one of the notes in the discourse, which I think rings true to everybody, that, you know, you have needs, of course, and you have wants, but there's this powerful tendency we have to let our needs become inflated and to need more and more when we know, in fact, that we could be content with less. And then we're back to Adam Smith about the kind of from one perspective, insane pressure we put on ourselves to get more in order to be happier, when the very activity of the getting makes us progressively unhappy. And Rousseau, as I see him, is trying to account for that, to offer an explanation, right, which must lead back to the questioning of sociality as part of our nature, or at least our original nature. And I guess it does necessarily have theological implications, sure, because there's another narrative there, another explanation. And it's very unsettling. I mean, Rousseau is unsettling for sure. And I think I said earlier that I don't really know any Rousseauians, and it's really hard to be a Rousseauian. But I think at a minimum, one has to grapple with Rousseau's challenge. So that's the way I put it. And that's the fruitful thing about including Rousseau in one of the courses that we would teach.
I think, with apologies to Joe, that we're going to have to end this excellent conversation. Just a quick reminder, I don't think any of you here need the reminder, but perhaps people watching this in video might, that registration is open for our 2021 online conference. Our theme is Crisis and Consolation. Liberal education in the time of COVID-19. So I hope to see papers and panels, and have lots of opportunities to talk to all of you. April 12th through 16th is the conference, but again, registration is open now, and you can go to our website, cortex.org. This was really fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone who came, and thank you, Dan.
Thanks. I'll work on the questions I dodged, and try and try and write up a better answer to you. I have a fundraising idea before we go, and this will work magically for the conference. And that is, we have a giant mute jar that you have to put $1 in every time you forget to unmute yourself. So I'm just going to pay $50 forward to ACTC myself.
I love it. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlotte.